Chapter 1. A Renaissance. If the start of the modern renaissance of psychedelic research can be dated with any precision, one good place to do it would be the year 2006. Not that this was obvious to many people at the time. There was no law passed or regulation lifted or discovery announced to mark the historical shift. But as three unrelated events unfolded during the course of that year, the first in Basel, Switzerland, the second in Washington, D.C., and the third in Baltimore, Maryland, sensitive ears could make out the sound of ice beginning to crack. The first event, which looked back but also forward like a kind of historical hinge, was the centennial of the birth of Albert Hofmann, the Swiss chemist who, in 1943, accidentally found that he had discovered, 5 years earlier, the psychoactive molecule that came to be known as LSD. This was an unusual centennial in that the man being feted was very much in attendance. Entering his second century, Hofmann appeared in remarkably good shape, physically spry and mentally sharp, and he was able to take an active part in the festivities, which included a birthday ceremony followed by a 3-day symposium. The symposium's opening ceremony was on January 13th, 2 days after Hofmann's 100th birthday. He would live to be 102. 2,000 people packed the hall at the Basel Congress Center, rising to applaud as a stooped stick of a man in a dark suit and a necktie, barely 5 feet tall, slowly crossed the stage and took his seat. 200 journalists from around the world were in attendance, along with more than 1,000 healers, seekers, mystics, psychiatrists, pharmacologists, consciousness researchers, and neuroscientists, most of them people whose lives had been profoundly altered by the remarkable molecule that this man had derived from a fungus half a century before. They had come to celebrate him and what his friend, the Swiss poet and physician Walter Voigt, had called the only joyous invention of the 20th century. Among the people in the hall, this did not qualify as hyperbole. According to one of the American scientists in attendance, many had come to worship Albert Hofmann, and indeed the event bore many of the hallmarks of a religious observance. Although virtually every person in that hall knew the story of LSD's discovery by heart, Hofmann was asked to recite the creation myth one more time. He tells the story memorably in his 1979 memoir, LSD, My Problem Child. As a young chemist working in a unit of Sandoz Laboratories charged with isolating the compounds in medicinal plants to find new drugs, Hofmann had been tasked with synthesizing, one by one, the molecules in the alkaloids produced by ergot. Ergot is a fungus that can infect grain, often rye, occasionally causing those who consume bread made from it to appear mad or possessed. One theory of the Salem witch trials blames ergot poisoning for the behavior of the women accused. But midwives had long used ergot to induce labor and staunch bleeding postpartum, so Sandoz was hoping to isolate a marketable drug from the fungus's alkaloids. In the fall of 1938, Hofmann made the 25th molecule in this series, naming it lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD-25 for short. Preliminary testing of the compound on animals did not show much promise. They became restless, but that was about it. So the formula for LSD-25 was put on the shelf. And there it remained for 5 years, until one April day in 1943, in the middle of the war, when Hofmann had a peculiar presentiment that LSD-25 deserved a second look. Here his account takes a slightly mystical turn. Normally, when a compound showing no promise was discarded, he explained, it was discarded for good. But Hofmann liked the chemical structure of the LSD molecule, he said, and something about it told him that this substance could possess properties other than those established in the first investigations. Another mysterious anomaly occurred when he synthesized LSD-25 for the second time. Despite the meticulous precautions he always took when working with a substance as toxic as ergot, Hofmann must somehow have absorbed a bit of the chemical through his skin because he was, quote, interrupted in my work by unusual sensations. Hoffmann went home, lay down on a couch, and, quote, "In a dreamlike state, with eyes closed, I perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with intense kaleidoscopic play of colors." Thus unfolds the world's first LSD trip in neutral Switzerland during the darkest days of World War II. It is also the only LSD trip ever taken that was entirely innocent of expectation. Intrigued, Hoffmann decided a few days later to conduct an experiment on himself, not an uncommon practice at the time. Proceeding with what he thought was extreme caution, he ingested 0.25 milligrams. A milligram is 1/1000th of a gram of LSD dissolved in a glass of water. This would represent a minuscule dose of any other drug, but LSD, it turns out, is one of the most potent psychoactive compounds ever discovered, active at doses measured in micrograms, that is, 1/1000th of a milligram. This surprising fact would soon inspire scientists to look for and eventually find the brain receptors and the endogenous chemical, serotonin, that activates them like a key in a lock, as a way to explain how such a small number of molecules could have such a profound effect on the mind. In this and other ways, Hoffmann's discovery helped to launch modern brain science in the 1950s. Now unfolds the world's first bad acid trip, as Hoffmann is plunged into what he is certain is irretrievable madness. He tells his lab assistant he needs to get home, and with the use of automobiles restricted during wartime, he somehow manages to pedal home by bicycle and lie down while his assistant summons the doctor. Today, LSD devotees celebrate Bicycle Day each year on April 19th. Hoffmann describes how, quote, "familiar objects and pieces of furniture assumed grotesque, threatening forms. They were in continuous motion, animated as if driven by an inner restlessness." He experienced the disintegration of the outer world and the dissolution of his own ego. Quote, "A demon had invaded me, had taken possession of my body, mind, and soul. I jumped up and screamed, trying to free myself from him, but then sank down again and lay helpless on the sofa." Hoffmann became convinced he was going to be rendered permanently insane or might actually be dying. Quote, "My ego was suspended somewhere in space, and I saw my body lying dead on the sofa." When the doctor arrived and examined him, however, he found that all of Hoffmann's vital signs, heartbeat, blood pressure, breathing, were perfectly normal. The only indication something was amiss were his pupils, which were dilated in the extreme. Once the acute effects wore off, Hoffmann felt the afterglow that frequently follows a psychedelic experience, the exact opposite of a hangover. When he walked out into his garden after a spring rain, quote, "everything glistened and sparkled in a fresh light. The world was as if newly created." We've since learned that the experience of psychedelics is powerfully influenced by one's expectation. No other class of drugs are more suggestible in their effects. Because Hoffmann's experience with LSD are the only ones we have that are uncontaminated by previous accounts, it's interesting to note they exhibit neither the Eastern nor the Christian flavorings that would soon become conventions of the genre. However, his experience of familiar objects coming to life and the world as if newly created, the same rapturous Adamic moment that Aldous Huxley would describe so vividly a decade later in The Doors of Perception, would become commonplaces of the psychedelic experience. Hoffmann came back from his trip convinced, first, that LSD had somehow found him rather than the other way around, and second, that LSD would someday be of great value to medicine, and especially psychiatry, possibly by offering research as a model of schizophrenia. It never occurred to him that his problem child, as he eventually would regard LSD, would also become a pleasure drug and a drug of abuse. Yet Hoffmann also came to regard the youth culture's adoption of LSD in the 1960s as an understandable response to the emptiness of what he described as a materialist, industrialized, and spiritually impoverished society that had lost its connection to nature. This master of chemistry, perhaps the most materialist of all disciplines, emerged from his experience with LSD-25, convinced the molecule offered civilization not only a potential therapeutic, but also a spiritual balm by opening a crack in, quote, the edifice of materialist rationality, in the words of his friend and translator, Jonathan Ott. Like so many who followed after him, the brilliant chemist became something of a mystic, preaching a gospel of spiritual renewal and reconnection with nature. Presented with a bouquet of roses that 2006 day in Basel, the scientist told the assembled that, quote, the feeling of co-creatureliness with all things alive should enter our consciousness more fully and counterbalance the materialistic and nonsensical technological developments in order to enable us to return to the roses, to the flowers, to nature where we belong. The audience erupted in applause. A skeptical witness to the event would not be entirely wrong to regard the little man on the stage as the founder of a new religion and the audience as his congregation. But if this is a religion, it's one with a significant difference. Typically, only the founder of a religion and perhaps a few early acolytes can lay claim to the kind of authority that flows from a direct experience of the sacred. For everyone coming after, there is the comparatively thin gruel of the stories, the symbolism of the sacrament, and faith. History attenuates the original power of it all, which now must be mediated by the priests. But the extraordinary promise on offer in the Church of Psychedelics is that anyone at any time may gain access to the primary religious experience by means of the sacrament, which happens to be a psychoactive molecule. Faith is rendered superfluous. Running alongside the celebration's spiritual undercurrent, however, there also, perhaps somewhat incongruously, came science. During the weekend symposium following the observation of Hoffmann's birthday, researchers from a variety of disciplines, including neuroscience, psychiatry, pharmacology, and consciousness studies, as well as the arts, explored the impact of Hoffmann's invention on society and culture and its potential for expanding our understanding of consciousness and treating several intractable mental disorders. A handful of research projects studying the effects of psychedelics on humans had been approved or were underway in Switzerland and the United States, and scientists at the symposium voiced their hope that the long hiatus in psychedelic research might finally be coming to an end. Irrational exuberance seems to be an occupational hazard among people working in this area, but in 2006, there was good reason to think that the weather might actually be turning. The second watershed event of 2006 came only 5 weeks later, when the U.S. Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision written by the new Chief Justice, John G. Roberts, Jr., ruled that the UDV, a tiny religious sect that uses a hallucinogenic tea called ayahuasca as its sacrament, could import the drink to the United States, even though it contains the Schedule I substance dimethyltryptamine, or DMT. The ruling was based on the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993, which had sought to clarify the right, under the First Amendment's Religious Freedom Clause, of Native Americans to use peyote in their ceremonies, as they have done for generations. The 1993 law says that only if the government has a compelling interest can it interfere with one's practice of religion. In the UDV case, the Bush administration had argued that only Native Americans, because of their unique relationship to the government, had the right to use psychedelics as part of their worship, and even in their case, this right could be abridged by the state. The court soundly rejected the government's argument, interpreting the 1993 law to mean that, absent a compelling state interest, the federal government cannot prohibit a recognized religious group from using psychedelic substances in their observances. Evidently, this includes relatively new and tiny religious groups specifically organized around a psychedelic sacrament or plant medicine, as the ayahuasqueros call their tea. The UDV is a Christian Spiritist sect founded in 1961 in Brazil by José Gabriel da Costa, a rubber tapper inspired by revelations he experienced after receiving ayahuasca from an Amazonian shaman 2 years before. The church claims 17,000 members in 6 countries, but at the time of the ruling there were only 130 American members of the UDV. The initials stand for União do Vegetal, or Union of the Plants, because ayahuasca is made by brewing together two Amazonian plant species, Banisteriopsis caapi and Psychotria viridis. The court's decision inspired something of a religious awakening around ayahuasca in America. Today there are close to 525 American members of the church, with communities in 9 locations. To supply them, the UDV has begun growing the plants needed to make the tea in Hawaii and shipping it to groups on the mainland without interference. But the number of Americans participating in ayahuasca ceremonies outside the UDV has also mushroomed in the years since, and any given night there are probably dozens, if not hundreds, of ceremonies taking place somewhere in America, with concentrations in the San Francisco Bay Area and Brooklyn. Federal prosecutions for possession or importation of ayahuasca appear to have stopped, at least for the time being. With its 2006 decision, the Supreme Court seemed to have opened up a religious path, narrow perhaps, but firmly rooted in the Bill of Rights, to the legal recognition of psychedelic drugs, at least when they're being used as a sacrament by a religious community. It remains to be seen how wide or well-trod that path will become, but it does make you wonder what the government and the court will do when an American, Jose Gabriel da Costa, steps forward and attempts to turn his or her own psychedelic revelations into a new religion intent on using a psychoactive chemical as its sacrament. The jurisprudence of cognitive liberty, as some in the psychedelic community call it, is still scant and limited to religion, but now it has been affirmed, opening a new crack in the edifice of the drug war. Of the 3 2006 events that helped bring psychedelics out of their decades-long slumber, by far the most far-reaching in its impact was the publication that summer of the paper in Psychopharmacology described in the prologue, the one Bob Jesse emailed me at the time, but that I didn't bother to open. This event, too, had a distinctly spiritual cast, even though the experiment it reported was the work of a rigorous and highly regarded scientist, Roland Griffiths. It just so happens that Griffiths, a most unlikely psychedelic researcher, was inspired to investigate the power of psilocybin to occasion a mystical-type experience by a mystical experience of his own. Griffiths' landmark paper, Psilocybin Can Occasion Mystical-Type Experiences Having Substantial and Sustained Personal Meaning and Spiritual Significance, was the first rigorously designed, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical study in more than 4 decades, if not ever, to examine the psychological effects of a psychedelic. It received a small torrent of press coverage, most of it so enthusiastic as to make you wonder if the moral panic around psychedelics that took hold in the late 60s might finally have run its course. No doubt the positive tenor of the coverage owed much to the fact that, at Griffiths' urging, the journal had invited several of the world's most prominent drug researchers, some of them decorated soldiers in the drug war, to comment on the study, giving the journalists covering the study plenty of ideological cover. All of the commentators treated the publication as a major event. Herbert D. Kleber, a former deputy to William Bennett, George H.W. Bush's drug czar, and later director of the Division on Substance Abuse at Columbia University, applauded the paper for its methodological rigor and acknowledged there might be, quote, major therapeutic possibilities in psychedelic research, meriting NIH support. Charles Bob Schuster, who had served 2 Republican presidents as director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, or NIDA, noted that the term psychedelic implies a mind-expanding experience and expressed his, quote, hope that this landmark paper will also be field-expanding. He suggested that this fascinating class of drugs and the spiritual experience they occasion might prove useful in treating addiction. Griffiths' paper and its reception served to reinforce an important distinction between the so-called classical psychedelics, psilocybin, LSD, DMT, and mescaline, and the more common drugs of abuse with their demonstrated toxicity and potential for addiction. The American Drug Research Establishment, such as it is, had signaled in the pages of one of its leading journals that these psychedelic drugs deserved to be treated very differently, and had demonstrated, in the words of one commentator, that, when used appropriately, these compounds can produce remarkable, possibly beneficial effects that certainly deserve further study. The story of how this paper came to be sheds an interesting light on the fraught relationship between science and that other realm of human inquiry that science has historically disdained and generally wants nothing to do with, spirituality. For in designing this, the first modern study of psilocybin, Griffiths had decided to focus not on a potential therapeutic application of the drug, the path taken by other researchers hoping to rehabilitate other banned substances like MDMA, but rather on the spiritual effects of the experience on so-called healthy normals. What good was that? In an editorial accompanying Griffiths' paper, the University of Chicago psychiatrist and drug abuse expert Harriet DeWitt tried to address this tension, pointing out that the quest for experiences that, quote, free oneself of the bounds of everyday perception and thought in a search for universal truths and enlightenment is an abiding element of our humanity that has nevertheless, quote, enjoyed little credibility in the mainstream scientific world. The time had come, she suggested, for science to, quote, recognize these extraordinary subjective experiences, even if they sometimes involve claims about ultimate realities that lie outside the purview of science. Roland Griffiths might be the last scientist one would ever imagine getting mixed up with psychedelics, which surely helps explain his success in returning psychedelic research to scientific respectability. 6 feet tall and rail-thin, Griffiths, in his 70s, holds himself bolt upright. The only undisciplined thing about him is a thatch of white hair so dense it appears to have held his comb to a draw. At least until you get him talking about the ultimate questions, which light him up, he comes across as the ultimate straight arrow, sober, earnest, and methodical. Born in 1944, Griffiths grew up in El Cerrito, California, in the Bay Area, and went to Occidental College for his undergraduate education, majoring in psychology, and then on to the University of Minnesota to study psychopharmacology. At Minnesota in the late 1960s, he came under the influence of B.F. Skinner, the radical behaviorist who helped shift the focus of psychology from the exploration of inner states and subjective experience to the study of outward behavior and how it is conditioned. Behaviorism has little interest in plumbing the depths of the human psyche, but the approach proved very useful in studying behaviors like drug use and dependence, which became Griffiths' specialty. Psychedelic drugs played no role in either his formal or his informal education. By the time Griffiths got to graduate school, Timothy Leary's notorious psychedelic research project at Harvard had already collapsed in scandal, and, quote, it was clear from my mentors that these were compounds that had no future. In 1972, right out of graduate school, Griffiths was hired at Johns Hopkins, where he has worked ever since, making his mark as a researcher studying the mechanisms of dependence in a variety of legal and illegal drugs, including the opiates, the so-called sedative hypnotics like Valium, nicotine, alcohol, and caffeine. Working under grants from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, Griffiths helped pioneer the sorts of experiments in which an animal, often a baboon or a rat, is presented with a lever allowing it to self-administer various drugs intravenously, a powerful tool for researchers studying reinforcement, dependence, preferences, lunch or more cocaine, and withdrawal. The 55 papers he published exploring the addictive properties of caffeine transformed the field, helping us to see coffee less as a food than as a drug, and led to the listing of caffeine withdrawal syndrome in the most recent edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM-5. By the time Griffiths turned 50 in 1994, he was a scientist at the top of his game and his field. But that year, Griffiths' career took an unexpected turn, the result of 2 serendipitous introductions. The first came when a friend introduced him to Siddha Yoga. Despite his behaviorist orientation as a scientist, Griffiths had always been interested in what philosophers call phenomenology, the subjective experience of consciousness. He had tried meditation as a graduate student, but found that, quote, he couldn't sit still without going stark raving mad. 3 minutes felt like 3 hours. But when he tried it again in 1994, something opened up for me. He started meditating regularly, going on retreats, and working his way through a variety of Eastern spiritual traditions. he found himself drawn, quote, deeper and deeper into this mystery. Somewhere along the way, Griffiths had what he modestly describes as, quote, a funny kind of awakening, a mystical experience. I was surprised when Griffiths mentioned this during our first meeting in his office, so I hadn't followed up. But even after I had gotten to know him a little better, Griffiths was still reluctant to say much more about exactly what happened, and as someone who had never had such an experience, I had trouble gaining any traction with the idea whatsoever. All he would tell me is that the experience, which took place in his meditation practice, acquainted him with, quote, something way, way beyond a material world view that I can't really talk to my colleagues about, because it involves metaphors or assumptions that I'm really uncomfortable with as a scientist. In time, what he was learning about, quote, the mystery of consciousness and existence in his meditation practice came to seem more compelling to him than his science. He began to feel somewhat alienated. None of the people I was close to had any interest in entertaining those questions, which fell into the general category of the spiritual, and religious people I just didn't get. Here I am, a full professor, publishing like crazy, running off to important meetings, and thinking I was a fraud. He began to lose interest in the research that had organized his whole adult life. I could study a new sedative hypnotic, learn something new about brain receptors, be on another FDA panel, go to another conference, but so what? I was more emotionally and intellectually curious about where this other path might lead. My drug research began to seem vacuous. I was going through the motions at work, much more interested in going home in the evening to meditate. The only way he could motivate himself to continue writing grants was to think of it as a service project for his graduate students and postdocs. In the case of his caffeine research, Griffiths had been able to take his curiosity about a dimension of his own experience, why did he feel compelled to drink coffee every day, and turn it into a productive line of scientific inquiry. But he could see no way to do that with his deepening curiosity about the dimensions of consciousness that meditation had opened up to him. He said, "It never occurred to me that there was any way to study it scientifically." Stymied and bored, Griffiths began to entertain thoughts of quitting science and going off to an ashram in India. It was around this time that Bob Schuster, an old friend and colleague who had recently retired as head of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, phoned Griffiths to suggest he talk to a young man he had recently met at Esalen named Bob Jesse. Jesse had organized a small gathering of researchers, therapists, and religious scholars at the legendary Big Sur Retreat Center to discuss the spiritual and therapeutic potential of psychedelic drugs and how they might be rehabilitated. Jesse himself was neither a medical professional nor a scientist. He was a computer engineer, a vice president of business development at Oracle, who had made it his mission to revive the science of psychedelics, but as a tool not so much of medicine as of spiritual development. Griffiths had told Schuster a little about his spiritual practice and confided in him his growing discontent with conventional drug research. "You should talk to this guy," Schuster told him. "They have some interesting ideas about working with entheogens," he said. "You might have something in common." When the history of second-wave psychedelic research is written, Bob Jesse will be seen as one of a pair of scientific outsiders in America, amateurs really, and brilliant eccentrics who worked tirelessly, often behind the scenes, to get it off the ground. Both found their vocation in the wake of transformative psychedelic experiences that convinced them that these substances had the potential to heal not only individuals, but humankind as a whole, and that the best path to their rehabilitation was by way of credible scientific research. In many cases, these untrained researchers dreamed up the experiments first and then found and funded the scientists to conduct them. Often you will find their names on the papers, usually in the last position. Of the two, Rick Doblin has been at it longer and is by far the more well-known. Doblin founded the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS, all the way back in the dark days of 1986. The year after MDMA was made illegal, and a time when most wiser heads were convinced that restarting research into psychedelics was a cause beyond hopeless. Doblin, born in 1953, is a great shaggy dog with a bone. He has been lobbying to change the government's mind about psychedelics since shortly after graduating from New College in Florida in 1987. After experimenting with LSD as an undergraduate and later with MDMA, Doblin decided his calling in life was to become a psychedelic therapist. But after the banning of MDMA in 1985, that dream became unachievable without a change in federal laws and regulations. So he decided he'd better first get a doctorate in public policy at Harvard's Kennedy School. There, he mastered the intricacies of the FDA's drug approval process, and in his dissertation plotted the laborious path to official acceptance that psilocybin and MDMA are now following. Doblin is disarmingly, perhaps helplessly candid, happy to talk openly to a reporter about his formative psychedelic experiences as well as political strategy and tactics. Like Timothy Leary, Doblin is the happiest of warriors, never not smiling and exhibiting a degree of enthusiasm for the work you wouldn't expect from a man who has been knocking his head against the same wall for his entire adult life. Doblin works out of a somewhat Dickensian office tucked into the attic of his rambling colonial in Belmont, Massachusetts, at a desk stacked to the ceiling with precarious piles of manuscripts, journal articles, photographs, and memorabilia reaching back more than 40 years. Some of the memorabilia commemorates the time early in his career when Doblin decided the best way to end sectarian strife would be to mail a group of the world's spiritual leaders tablets of MDMA, a drug famous for its ability to break down barriers between people and kindle empathy. Around the same time, he arranged to have 1,000 doses of MDMA sent to people in the Soviet military who were working on arms control negotiations with President Reagan. For Doblin, winning FDA approval for the medical use of psychedelics, which he believes is now in view for both MDMA and psilocybin, is a means to a more ambitious and still more controversial end: the incorporation of psychedelics into American society and culture, not just medicine. This, of course, is the same winning strategy followed by the campaign to decriminalize marijuana, in which promoting the medical uses of cannabis changed the drug's image, leading to a more general public acceptance. Not surprisingly, this sort of talk rankles more cautious heads in the community, Bob Jesse among them, but Rick Doblin is not one to soft-pedal his agenda or to even think about taking an interview off the record. This gets him a lot of press. How much it helps the cause is debatable. But there is no question that, especially in the last several years, Doblin has succeeded in getting important research approved and funded, especially in the case of MDMA, which has long been MAPS's main focus. MAPS has sponsored several small clinical trials that have demonstrated MDMA's value in treating post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Doblin defines psychedelics generously so as to include MDMA and even cannabis, even though their mechanisms of action in the brain are very different from that of the classical psychedelics. But beyond helping those suffering with PTSD and other indications, MAPS is sponsoring a clinical study at UCLA that involves treating autistic adults with MDMA. Doblin believes fervently in the power of psychedelics to improve humankind by disclosing a spiritual dimension of consciousness we all share, regardless of our religious beliefs or lack thereof. Mysticism, he likes to say, is the antidote to fundamentalism. Compared with Rick Doblin, Bob Jesse is a monk. There is nothing shaggy or uncareful about him. Taut, press-shy, and disposed to choose his words with a pair of tweezers, Jesse, now in his 50s, prefers to do his work out of public view and preferably from the one-room cabin where he lives by himself in the rugged hills north of San Francisco, off the grid except for a fast internet connection. Bob Jesse is like the puppeteer, Catherine McLean told me. McLean is a psychologist who worked in Roland Griffith's lab from 2009 until 2013. He's the visionary guy working behind the scenes. Following Jesse's meticulous directions, I drove north from the Bay Area, eventually winding up at the end of a narrow dirt road in a county he asked me not to name. I parked at a trailhead and made my way past the "no trespassing" signs, following a path up a hill that brought me to his picturesque mountaintop camp. I felt as if I were going to visit the wizard. The ship-shaped little cabin is tight for two, so Jesse has set out among the fir trees and boulders some comfortable sofas, chairs, and tables. He's also built an outdoor kitchen, and on a shelf of rock commanding a spectacular view of the mountains, an outdoor shower, giving the camp the feeling of a house turned inside out. We spent the better part of an early spring day outdoors in his living room, sipping herbal tea and discussing his notably quieter campaign to restore psychedelics to respectability, a master plan in which Roland Griffiths plays a central role. "I'm a little camera shy," he began, "so please, no pictures or recordings of any kind." Jesse is a slender, compact fellow with a squarish head of closely cropped gray hair and rimless rectangular glasses that are unostentatiously stylish. Jesse seldom smiles and has some of the stiffness I associate with engineers, though occasionally he'll surprise you with a flash of emotion he will immediately then caption. You may have noticed that thinking about that subject made my eyes get a little watery. Let me explain why. Not only does he choose his own words with great care, but he insists that you do too. So, for example, when I carelessly deployed the term recreational use, he stopped me in mid-sentence. Maybe we need to re-examine that term. Typically, it is used to trivialize an experience. But why? In its literal meaning, the word recreation implies something decidedly non-trivial. There is much more to be said, but let's bookmark this topic for another time. Please, go on. My notes showed that Jesse took our first conversation on and off the record half a dozen times. Jesse grew up outside Baltimore and went to Johns Hopkins, where he studied computer science and electrical engineering. For several years in his 20s, he worked for Bell Labs, commuting weekly from Baltimore to New Jersey. During this period, he came out of the closet and persuaded management to recognize the company's first gay and lesbian employee group. At the time, AT&T, the parent company, employed some 300,000 people. Later, he persuaded AT&T management to fly a rainbow flag over headquarters during Gay Pride Week and send a delegation to march in the parade. This achievement formed Bob Jesse's political education, impressing on him the value of working behind the scenes without making a lot of noise or demanding credit. Jesse moved to Oracle in the Bay Area in 1990, becoming employee number 8,766. Not one of the first, but early enough to have acquired a chunk of stock in the company. It wasn't long before Oracle fielded its own contingent in San Francisco's Gay Pride Parade, and after Jesse's gentle prodding of senior management, Oracle became one of the first Fortune 500 companies to offer benefits to the same-sex partners of its employees. Jesse's curiosity about psychedelics was first piqued during a drug education unit in his high school science class. This particular class of drugs was neither physically nor psychologically addictive, he was told, correctly. His teacher went on to describe the drug's effects, including shifts in consciousness and visual perception, that Jesse found intriguing. I could sense that there was even more here than they were telling us, he recalled, so I made a mental note. But he would not be ready to see for himself what psychedelics were all about until much later. Why? He answered in the third person. A closeted gay kid might be afraid of what might come out if he let his guard down. In his 20s, while working at Bell Labs, Jesse fell in with a group of friends in Baltimore who decided, in a most deliberate way, to experiment with psychedelics. Someone would always remain, quote, close to ground level in case anyone needed help or the doorbell rang, and doses escalated gradually. It was during one of these Saturday afternoon experiments in an apartment in Baltimore that Jesse, 25 years old and having ingested a high dose of LSD, had a powerful, non-dual experience that would prove transformative. I asked him to describe it, and after some hemming and hawing, I hope you'll bracket what is sensitive, he gingerly proceeded to tell the story. I was lying on my back underneath a ficus tree, he recalls. I knew it was going to be a strong experience, and the point came where the little I still was just started slipping away. I lost all awareness of being on the floor in an apartment in Baltimore. I couldn't tell if my eyes were opened or closed. What opened up before me was, for lack of a better word, a space, but not our ordinary concept of space, just the pure awareness of a realm without form and void of content. And into that realm came a celestial entity, which was the emergence of the physical world. It was like the Big Bang, but without the boom or the blinding light. It was the birth of the physical universe. In one sense, it was dramatic, maybe the most important thing that had ever occurred in the history of the world, yet it just sort of happened. I asked him where he was in all this. I was a diffusely located observer. I was coextensive with this emergence. Here I let him know he was losing me. Long pause. I'm hesitating because the words are an awkward fit. Words seem too constraining. Ineffability is, of course, a hallmark of the mystical experience. The awareness transcends any particular sensory modality, he explained unhelpfully. Was it scary? There was no terror, only fascination and awe. Pause. Maybe a little fear. From here on, Jesse watched, or whatever you call it, the birth of everything in the unfolding of an epic sequence, beginning with the appearance of cosmic dust, leading to the creation of the stars and then the solar systems, followed by the emergence of life, and from there the arrival of what we call humans, then the acquisition of language and the unfolding of awareness, all the way up to oneself, here in this room, surrounded by my friends. I had come all the way back to right where I was. How much clock time had elapsed? I had no idea. What stands out most for me is the quality of the awareness I experience, something entirely distinct from what I've come to regard as Bob. How does this expanded awareness fit into the scope of things? To the extent I regard the experience as veridical, and about that I'm still not sure, it tells me that consciousness is primary to the physical universe. In fact, it precedes it. Did he now believe consciousness exists outside the brain? He's not certain. But to go from being very sure that the opposite is true, that consciousness is the product of our gray matter, to be unsure is an immense shift. I asked him if he agreed with something I'd read the Dalai Lama had said, that the idea that brains create consciousness, an idea accepted without question by most scientists, is, quote, a metaphysical assumption, not a scientific fact. Bingo, Jesse said. And for someone with my orientation, agnostic, enamored of science, that changes everything. Here's what I don't get about an experience like Bob Jesse's. Why in the world would you ever credit it at all? I didn't understand why you wouldn't simply file it under interesting dream or drug-induced fantasy. But along with the feeling of ineffability, the conviction that some profound objective truth has been disclosed to you is a hallmark of the mystical experience, regardless of whether it has been occasioned by a drug, meditation, fasting, flagellation, or sensory deprivation. William James gave a name to this conviction, the noetic quality. People feel they have been let in on a deep secret of the universe, and they cannot be shaken from that conviction. As James wrote, dreams cannot stand this test. No doubt, this is why some of the people who have had such an experience go on to found religions, changing the course of history or, in a great many more cases, the course of their own lives. No doubt is the key. I can think of a couple of ways to account for such a phenomenon, neither entirely satisfying. The most straightforward and yet hardest to accept explanation is that it's simply true. The altered state of consciousness has opened the person up to a truth that the rest of us, imprisoned in ordinary waking consciousness, simply cannot see. Science has trouble with this interpretation, however, because whatever the perception is, it can't be verified by its customary tools. It's an anecdotal report, in effect, and so has no value. Science has little interest in and tolerance for the testimony of the individual. In this, it is, curiously, much like an organized religion, which has a big problem crediting direct revelation too. But it's worth pointing out that there are cases where science has no choice but to rely on individual testimony, as in the study of subjective consciousness, which is inaccessible to our scientific tools and so can only be described by the person experiencing it. Here, phenomenology is the all-important data. However, this is not the case when ascertaining truths about the world outside our heads. The problem with crediting mystical experiences is precisely that they often seem to erase the distinction between inside and outside, in the way that Bob Jesse's diffuse awareness seemed to be his, but also to exist outside him. This points to the second possible explanation for the noetic sense. When our sense of a subjective I disintegrates, as it often does in a high-dose psychedelic experience, as well as in meditation by experienced meditators, it becomes impossible to distinguish between what is subjectively and objectively true. What's left to do the doubting, if not your eye? In the years following that first powerful psychedelic journey, Bob Jesse had a series of other experiences that shifted the course of his life. Living in San Francisco in the early 1990s, he got involved in the rave scene and discovered that the collective effervescence of the best all-night dance parties, with or without psychedelic materials, could also dissolve the subject-object duality and open up new spiritual vistas. He began to explore various spiritual traditions, from Buddhism to Quakerism to meditation, and found his priorities in life gradually shifting. It began to occur to me that spending time in this area might actually be far more important and far more fulfilling than what I had been doing as a computer engineer. While on a sabbatical from Oracle, he would leave for good in 1995, Jesse set up a nonprofit called the Council on Spiritual Practices, or CSP, with the aim of, quote, making direct experience of the sacred more available to more people. The website downplays the organization's interest in promoting entheogens, Bob Jesse's preferred term for psychedelics, but does describe its mission in suggestive terms: to, quote, identify and develop approaches to primary religious experience that can be used safely and effectively. The website, csp.org, offers an excellent bibliography of psychedelic research and regular updates on the work underway at Johns Hopkins. CSP would also play a role in supporting the UDV lawsuit that resulted in the 2006 Supreme Court decision. The Council on Spiritual Practices grew out of Jesse's systematic exploration of the psychedelic literature and the psychedelic community in the Bay Area soon after he moved to San Francisco. In his highly deliberate, slightly obsessive, and scrupulously polite way, Jesse contacted the region's numerous psychedelic elders, the rich cast of characters who had been deeply involved in research and therapy in the years before most of the drugs were banned in 1970, with the passing of the Controlled Substances Act and the classification of LSD and psilocybin as Schedule I substances with a high potential for abuse and no recognized medical use. There was James Fadiman, the Stanford-trained psychologist who had done pioneering research on psychedelics and problem-solving at the International Foundation for Advanced Study in Menlo Park until the FDA halted the group's work in 1966. In the early 1960s, there was at least as much psychedelic research going on around Stanford as there was at Harvard. It just didn't have a character of the wattage of a Timothy Leary out talking about it. Then there was Fadiman's colleague at the Institute, Myron Stolaroff, a prominent Silicon Valley electrical engineer who worked as a senior executive at Ampex, the magnetic recording equipment maker, until an LSD trip inspired him to give up engineering, much like Bob Jesse, for a career as a psychedelic researcher and therapist. Jesse also found his way into the inner circle of Sasha and Ann Shulgin, legendary Bay Area figures who held weekly dinners for a community of therapists, scientists, and others interested in psychedelics. Sasha Shulgin, who died in 2014, was a brilliant chemist who held a DEA license, allowing him to synthesize novel psychedelic compounds, which he did in prodigious numbers. He was also one of the first to synthesize MDMA since it had been patented by Merck in 1912 and forgotten. Recognizing its psychoactive properties, he introduced the so-called empathogen to the Bay Area's psychotherapy community. Only later did it become the club drug known as ecstasy. Jesse also befriended Houston Smith, the scholar of comparative religion, whose mind had been open to the spiritual potential of psychedelics when, as an instructor-lecturer at MIT in 1962, he served as a volunteer in the Good Friday experiment, from which he came away convinced that a mystical experience occasioned by a drug was no different from any other kind. By way of these elders and his own reading, Jesse began unearthing the rich body of first-wave psychedelic research, much of which had been lost to science. He learned that there had been more than 1,000 scientific papers on psychedelic drug therapy before 1965, involving more than 40,000 research subjects. Beginning in the 1950s and continuing into the early 1970s, psychedelic compounds had been used to treat a variety of conditions, including alcoholism, depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and anxiety at the end of life, frequently with impressive results. But few of the studies were well controlled by modern standards, and some of them were compromised by the enthusiasm of the researchers involved. Of even keener interest to Bob Jesse was the early research exploring the potential of psychedelics to contribute to what, in a striking phrase, he calls the betterment of well people. There had been studies of healthy normals of artistic and scientific creativity and spirituality. The most famous of these was the Good Friday or Marsh Chapel experiment, conducted in 1962 by Walter Pahnke, a psychiatrist and minister working on a PhD dissertation at Harvard under Timothy Leary. In this double-blind experiment, 20 divinity students received a capsule of white powder during a Good Friday service at Marsh Chapel on the Boston University campus, 10 of them containing psilocybin, 10 an active placebo, in this case niacin, which creates a tingling sensation. 8 of the 10 students receiving psilocybin reported a powerful mystical experience, while only 1 in the control group did. Telling them apart was not difficult, rendering the double-blind a somewhat hollow conceit. Those on the placebo sat sedately in their pews, while the others lay down or wandered about the chapel, muttering things like, "God is everywhere," and "Oh, the glory." Pahnke concluded that the experiences of those who received the psilocybin were, quote, indistinguishable from, if not identical with, the classic mystical experiences reported in the literature. Houston Smith agreed. Until the Good Friday experiment, he told an interviewer in 1996, I had had no direct personal encounter with God. In 1986, Rick Doblin conducted a follow-up study of the Good Friday experiment in which he tracked down and interviewed all but 1 of the divinity students who received psilocybin at Marsh Chapel. Most reported that the experience had reshaped their lives and work in profound and enduring ways. However, Doblin found serious flaws in Pahnke's published account. Pahnke had failed to mention that several subjects had struggled with acute anxiety during their experience. One had to be restrained and given an injection of Thorazine, a powerful antipsychotic, after he fled from the chapel and headed down Commonwealth Avenue, convinced he'd been chosen to announce the news of the coming of the Messiah. In this and a second review of another Timothy Leary supervised experiment, of recidivism at Concord State Prison, Doblin had raised troubling questions about the quality of the research done in the Harvard psilocybin project, suggesting that the enthusiasm of the experimenters had tainted the reported results. If this research were going to be revived and taken seriously, Jesse concluded, it would have to be done with considerably more rigor and objectivity. And yet the results of the Good Friday experiment were highly suggestive. And, as Bob Jesse and Roland Griffiths would soon decide, well worth trying to reproduce. Bob Jesse spent the early 1990s excavating the knowledge about psychedelics that had been lost when formal research was halted and informal research went underground. In this, he was a little like those Renaissance scholars who rediscovered the lost world of classical thought in a handful of manuscripts squirreled away in monasteries. However, in this case, considerably less time had elapsed, so the knowledge remained in the brains of people still alive, like James Fadiman and Myron Stolaroff and Willis Harman, another Bay Area engineer turned psychedelic researcher, who merely had to be asked for it, and in scientific papers in libraries and databases, which merely had to be searched. But if there is a modern analogy to the medieval monastery where the world of classical thought was saved from oblivion, a place where the guttering flame of psychedelic knowledge was assiduously fanned during its own dark age, that place would have to be Esalen, the legendary retreat center in Big Sur, California. Perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific, as if barely clinging to the continent, the Esalen Institute was founded in 1962 and ever since has been a center of gravity for the so-called human potential movement in America, serving as the unofficial capital of the New Age. A great many therapeutic and spiritual modalities were developed and taught here over the years, including the therapeutic and spiritual potential of psychedelics. Beginning in 1973, Stanislav Grof, the Czech émigré psychiatrist who is one of the pioneers of LSD-assisted psychotherapy, served as scholar-in-residence at Esalen, but he had conducted workshops there for years before. Grof, who has guided thousands of LSD sessions, once predicted that psychedelics, quote, would be for psychiatry what the microscope is for biology or the telescope is for astronomy. These tools make it possible to study important processes that under normal circumstances are not available for direct observation. Hundreds came to Esalen to peer through that microscope, often in workshops Grof led for psychotherapists who wanted to incorporate psychedelics in their practices. Many, if not most, of the therapists and guides now doing this work underground learned their craft at the feet of Stan Grof in the Big House at Esalen. Whether such work continued at Esalen after LSD was made illegal is uncertain, but it wouldn't be surprising. The place is perched so far out over the edge of the continent as to feel beyond the reach of federal law enforcement. But at least officially, such workshops ended when LSD became illegal. Grof began teaching instead something called holotropic breathwork, a technique for inducing a psychedelic state of consciousness without drugs by means of deep, rapid, and rhythmic breathing, usually accompanied by loud drumming. Yet Esalen's role in the history of psychedelics did not end with their prohibition. It became the place where people hoping to bring these molecules back into the culture, whether as an adjunct to therapy or a means of spiritual development, met to plot their campaigns. In January 1994, Bob Jesse managed to get himself invited to one such meeting at Esalen. While helping out with the dishes after a Friday night dinner at the Shulgins, Jesse learned that a group of therapists and scientists would be gathering in Big Sur to discuss the prospects for reviving psychedelic research. There were signs that the door Washington, D.C. had slammed shut on research in the late 1960s might be opening, if only a crack. Curtis Wright, a new administrator at the FDA, and as it happens a former student of Roland Griffiths at Hopkins, had signaled that research protocols for psychedelics would be treated like any other, judged on their merits. Testing this new receptivity, a psychiatrist at the University of New Mexico named Rick Strassman had sought and received approval to study the physiological effects of DMT, a powerful psychedelic compound found in many plants. This small trial marked the first federally sanctioned experiment with a psychedelic compound since the 1970s, in retrospect a watershed event. Around the same time, Rick Doblin and Charles Grobe, a psychiatrist at UCLA, had succeeded in persuading the government to approve the first human trial of MDMA. Grobe is one of the first psychiatrists to advocate for the return of psychedelics to psychotherapy. He later conducted the first modern trial of psilocybin for cancer patients. The year before the Esalen gathering, which Grobe and Doblin both attended, David Nichols, a Purdue University chemist and pharmacologist, launched the Hefter Research Institute, named for the German chemist who first identified the mescaline compound in 1897, with the then improbable ambition of funding serious psychedelic science. Hefter has since helped fund many of the modern trials of psilocybin. So there were scattered hopeful signs in the early 1990s that conditions were ripening for a revival of psychedelic research. The tiny community that had sustained such a dream through the dark ages began, tentatively, quietly, to organize. Even though Jesse was new to this community and neither a scientist nor a therapist, he asked if he could attend the Esalen meeting and offered to make himself useful, refilling water glasses if that's what it took. Most of the gathering was taken up with discussions of the potential medical applications of psychedelics, as well as the need for basic research on the neuroscience. Jesse was struck by the fact that so little attention was paid to the spiritual potential of these compounds. He left the meeting convinced that, okay, there is room to maneuver here. I was hoping one of these people would pick up the ball and run with it, but they were busy with the other ball. So I made a decision to seek a leave of absence from Oracle. Within a year, Jesse would launch the Council on Spiritual Practices, and within 2, the Council would convene its own meeting at Esalen in January 1996 with the aim of opening a second front in the campaign to resurrect psychedelics. Fittingly, the gathering took place in the Maslow Room at Esalen, named for the psychologist whose writings on the hierarchy of human needs underscored the importance of peak experiences in self-actualization. Most of the 15 in attendance were psychedelic elders, therapists and researchers like James Fadiman and Willis Harman, Mark Kleiman, then a drug policy expert at the Kennedy School and Rick Doblin's thesis tutor there, and religious figures like Houston Smith, Brother David Stendhal Rast, and Jeffrey Bronfman, the head of the UDV Church in America and heir to the Seagram's liquor fortune. But Jesse wisely decided to invite an outsider as well, Charles Bob Schuster, who had served both Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush as director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Jesse didn't know Schuster well at all. They had once spoken briefly at a conference. But Jesse came away from the encounter thinking Schuster just might be receptive to an invitation. Exactly why Bob Schuster, a leading figure in the academic establishment undergirding the drug war, would be open to the idea of coming to Esalen to discuss the spiritual potential of psychedelics was a mystery, at least until I had the opportunity to speak to his widow, Chris Ellen Johansson. Johansson, who is also a drug researcher, painted a picture of a man of exceptionally broad interests and deep curiosity. Bob was open-minded to a fault, she told me with a laugh. He would talk to anyone. Like many people in the NIDA community, Schuster well understood that the psychedelics fit awkwardly into the profile of a drug of abuse. Animals given the choice will not self-administer a psychedelic more than once, and the classical psychedelics exhibit remarkably little toxicity. I asked Johnson if Schuster had ever taken a psychedelic himself. Roland Griffiths had told me he thought it was possible. Bob was a jazz musician, Griffiths told me, so I wouldn't be at all surprised. But Johansson said no. He was definitely curious about them, she told me, but I think he was too afraid. We were martini people. I asked if he was a spiritual man. Not really, though I think he would have liked to have been. Jesse, not quite sure what Schuster would make of the meeting, arranged to have Jim Fadiman bunk with him, instructing Fadiman, a psychologist, to check him out. Jesse told me, early the next morning, Jim found me and said, "Bob, mission accomplished. You have found a gem of a human being." Schuster thoroughly enjoyed his time at Esalen, according to his wife. He took part in a drumming circle Jesse had arranged. You don't leave Esalen without doing some such thing, and was amazed to discover how easily he could slip into a trance. But Schuster also made some key contributions to the group's deliberations. He warned Jesse off working with MDMA, which he believed was toxic to the brain, and had by then acquired an unsavory reputation as a club drug. He also suggested that psilocybin was a much better candidate for research than LSD, largely for political reasons. Because so many fewer people had heard of it, psilocybin carried none of the political and cultural baggage of LSD. By the end of the meeting, the Esalen group had settled on a short list of objectives, some of them modest, to draft a code of ethics for spiritual guides, and others more ambitious. Quote, to get above-board, unimpeachable research done at an institution with investigators beyond reproach, and ideally, do this without any pretext of clinical treatment. We weren't sure that this was possible, Jesse told me, but he and his colleagues believed, quote, it would be a big mistake if medicalization is all that happens. Why a mistake? Because Bob Jesse was ultimately less interested in people's mental problems than with their spiritual well-being, in using entheogens for the betterment of well people. Shortly after the Esalen meeting, Schuster made what would turn out to be his most important contribution, telling Bob Jesse about his old friend Roland Griffiths, whom he described as exactly the investigator beyond reproach Jesse was looking for, and, quote, a scientist of the first order. Everything Roland's done, he's devoted himself to completely, Jesse recalls Schuster saying, including his meditation practice. We think it's changed him. Griffiths had shared with Schuster his growing dissatisfaction with science and his deepening interest in the kind of ultimate questions coming up in his meditation practice. Schuster then made the call to Griffiths, telling him about the interesting young man he'd just met at Esalen, explaining that they shared an interest in spirituality and suggesting that they should meet. After an exchange of emails, Jesse flew to Baltimore to have lunch with Griffiths in the cafeteria on the Bayview Medical Campus, inaugurating a series of conversations and meetings that would eventually lead to their collaboration on the 2006 study of psilocybin and mystical experience at Johns Hopkins. But there was still one missing piece of the puzzle and the scientific team. Most of the drug trials Griffiths had run in the past involved baboons and other non-human primates. He had much less clinical experience working with humans and realized he needed a skilled therapist to join the project, a master clinician, as he put it. As it happened, Bob Jesse had met a psychologist at a psychedelic conference a few years before who not only filled the bill, but lived in Baltimore. Still more fortuitous, this psychologist, whose name was Bill Richards, probably had more experience guiding psychedelic journeys in the 1960s and 1970s than anyone alive, with the possible exception of Stan Groff, with whom he had once worked. In fact, Bill Richards administered the very last legal dose of psilocybin to an American at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center at Spring Grove State Hospital in the spring of 1977. In the decades since, he had been practicing more conventional psychotherapy out of his home in a leafy Baltimore neighborhood called Windsor Hills, biding his time and waiting patiently for the world to come around so that he might work with psychedelics once again. In the big picture, he told me the first time we met in his home office, these drugs have been around at least 5,000 years, and many times they have surfaced and have been repressed. So this was another cycle. But the mushroom still grows, and eventually this work would come around again, or so I hoped. When he got the call from Bob Jesse in 1998 and met Roland Griffiths shortly thereafter, he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. It was thrilling, he said. Bill Richards, a preternaturally cheerful man in his 70s, is a bridge between the two eras of psychedelic therapy. Walter Pahnke was the best man at his wedding. He worked closely with Stan Groff at Spring Grove and visited Timothy Leary in Millbrook, New York, where Leary landed after his exile from Harvard. Though Richards left the Midwest half a century ago, he's retained the speech patterns of rural Michigan, where he was born in 1940. Richards today sports a white goatee, laughs with an infectious cackle, and ends many of his sentences with a cheerful, upspoken, "you know?" Richards, who holds graduate degrees in both psychology and divinity, had his first psychedelic experience while a divinity student at Yale in 1963.